The acting head of NOAA walked a fine line between defending the agency and defending President Trump after the president made the incorrect claim that Hurricane Dorian was a threat to Alabama. In a meeting, Neil Jacobs said NOAA's widely criticized statement contradicting Birmingham, Alabama's National Weather Service was meant to clarify, quote, technical aspects of Dorian's potential impact.
This all began when President Trump repeatedly and wrongly claimed Alabama would be among the states hardest hit by the hurricane, even displaying that infamous map there that you see that he or somebody altered with a Sharpie. Birmingham's local forecast office corrected the president, saying Alabama would not be hit by the storm, an action which reportedly got them in trouble.
So CBS News weather producer David Parkinson and CBS News contributing meteorologist Jeff Iardelli joining us now to talk a little bit more about this. So we thought, Sharpie Gate was sort of all over and done with, perhaps we are now sort of dealing with the final word. So David, let's start with you. There was an unsigned statement from NOAA contradicting the Birmingham Office of National Weather Service, which said that Alabama would not be impacted by Dorian. Was Alabama ever under a threat at some point, right?
Yeah, there was. So there was a threat a couple of days before that where they were, if you had extrapolated out the cone, it would have taken it there. There's a reason they end the cone at 5 days, and that's sort of the boundary of where we feel comfortable. The other thing that I would say also is that a reminder of what the cone is. This is a friendly reminder that it's just your historical average over the 5 years of your average error at that point in time. So only about 2/3 of the time do you fall into the cone at that 5-day period. So that's not to say that the chance was zero that Alabama would be impacted. It was greater than zero. But what we're trying to do when we message these storms is make sure that the most impacted people get the message of what they need to do. And so the more people you unnecessarily warn, the less likely it is that they will take you seriously the next time. And that's really the concern. It's not so much that you're over-warning them and you're putting them in danger that way for this storm. It's that in the future, people in Alabama, who, by the way, they got clipped by Michael last year, the southeastern section of the state had really, really strong hurricane force winds because that storm stayed strong fairly far inland. So it's not an area that doesn't get hit by hurricanes at all, and so to put them under alert unnecessarily, which is what a 10% or below probability would be at that time, that's really the concern.
So just to clarify, that I think it's called the spaghetti model that we have seen floating around that kind of included a portion of Alabama. When you looked at something like that, if you were to look at something like that, is that so far out that it's including possible things, speculation? It's just, would that be a document that you would start to build a forecast off of?
So there are two things. One, those were the spaghettis from a couple of days before. The spaghettis on the day that the tweet was authored did not have Alabama in any of the spaghetti options. What you look at the spaghetti for is two things. One, you look at it for a trend, which is to say, are they moving in one direction from the last couple of runs? And what does that tell you about where the forecast is going? And then you're also looking to average them out. So there are a lot of zany options that are never going to happen. There are things going loops and sideways and whatever. But what you're going to try and do is you're going to kind of find the middle path. And so basically the European, for example, that's the best model that we have. And then we run it 51 different times to get the ensembles. We tweak the physics ever so slightly in each of those. When you do that, you're now getting the best of the best, which is you're running it all of these different times. You're taking advantage of all that computing power. And the result of that ensemble forecast is more accurate than the single run, which is what you're used to seeing in the operational. So that's why that exists. That's why we do it. But you never take one of them individually, just like you shouldn't take the operational at face value.
Jeff, what I found really intriguing about this story is the mission of the National Weather Service. And I started doing a little reading into the history and why we even have a National Weather Service. And I thought it was interesting that the government came to the realization as we became, as people got more aware of the science behind weather and people started to become meteorologists, that there was a sense that everybody was trying to predict what the weather was going to do. And the government said, so that we don't put people into a panic, we need to establish an organization that people can trust, and that people can rely on. And that was the establishment of the National Weather Service, which said, there's a lot of fly-by-night people out there trying to tell you what's going on. Here's what you should trust. And that's why it's so important that they tweeted very quickly after the president tweeted that Alabama was going to be hit, that if you're in Alabama, don't worry, you're okay.
Right, so they are the standard bearer of scientific information, not only in the United States, but I would say in the world. And so you do not want to compromise their integrity, their objectivity, their impartiality. That's a no-no. We're seeing on social media there are a lot of these weekend weather warriors out there, tweeting all kinds of stuff, oftentimes trying to get clicks, trying to get likes. The National Weather Service does not operate that way. They protect lives and property, and so we need to keep them independent. I think that people still believe the National Weather Service offices. They're not going to change their forecast for a tornado, change a warning on the whim of the administration and the politics going on at that time. So people will still have confidence in that. The big question is, will they have confidence in the more sensitive stuff like climate change? If they know that NOAA is already compromised, the integrity is compromised, the objectivity is compromised, will they then believe that the information that comes out regarding sensitive stuff like climate change is true or not? And I would say that people will start to doubt that kind of information.
Is the NOAA head, sorry, Anne-Marie, is the NOAA head a political appointee?
It depends on who you're talking about.
Okay.
Right? The guy who delivered the speech yesterday, what was his name again?
Neil Jacobs.
Yeah.
Right. He is an appointee.
Okay.
But Louis Ussolini, who's the head of the National Weather Service, I think he may also be an appointee, but he's been with the National Weather for a long time. It depends on who exactly you're speaking of. It even is complicated for someone like.
The reason I ask is only because what I saw in the wake of this brouhaha is meteorologists, and I have no idea what their politics are, all coming out and saying that the integrity of the office is being compromised by towing a line to protect or to perhaps reinforce what the President of the United States is saying. And I know I was reading emails that you were sending to the national desk. You were pointing out to us when meteorologists or other scientists were chiming in on Twitter that these were legitimate, scientific, really not political people at all.
And if they are political, some of them were conservative. That's the interesting part, is that at first, when it first happened, they defended the president to some degree, saying, well, at one point it did look like the cone was maybe headed towards Alabama. But once Sharpiegate started, once somebody took a Sharpie and changed the cone, once they threw the National Weather Service Alabama office under the bus, once they defended the president, that was a no-no. That was a line that even for conservative meteorologists was crossed, and they came out strongly in support of the local National Weather Service offices and strongly against that statement defending President Trump.
Well, and that particular office, too. I mean, what the Birmingham office has to deal with, particularly in tornado season, particularly after the deadly tornado that happened earlier this year, it is one of the best offices out there. I mean, there are a couple superstars, Norman, Fort Worth, Birmingham. These are the offices that time in and time out, when lives are on the line, people put their trust in them. And so it's so important that whenever we build a forecast, we don't contradict each other. We sort of build and sort of pivot so that there's not these abrupt 180s. And I think that's the problem, is when you have a mixed message, when you don't have that clarity, you allow for some daylight, and daylight is how people can get hurt or killed.
And that is something they are sticklers for. In the weather community, we are all sticklers for consistent messages. And if someone's sending out an inconsistent message, they are called out immediately.
And so we're hearing that NOAA's acting chief scientist, Craig McLean, is going to be investigating. I guess there are many aspects to investigate here, from who sort of drew on the map, but also the processes that ensure that there's a united voice coming from the scientific community, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that ultimately what you're going to see here is when you take a look at Ussolini, when you take a look at Neil Jacobs, these are people who are well respected in the meteorological community, both in their current positions, and Ussolini literally wrote the book on eastern snowstorms.
That's right, he did.
Right.
Yes.
Is it called the book about eastern snowstorms?
I don't know the exact title, but he wrote it.
It's him and Cosin.
Cosin, yeah. And I mean, so these people are fairly well revered, and so that's why I mean the interesting thing about Jacobs is he's not Senate confirmed yet. Which there's this whole thing. They had one of the people who were running AccuWeather was nominated. There was a whole brouhaha in the weather community because he wasn't a scientist. Neil Jacobs is a scientist. He knows what he's doing. So there's a little bit more credit there. But what you're going to need, what I think the meteorological community is going to need to see from NOAA's chief scientists is that they're backing their own science and they're not crafting political messages.
Yeah.
All right. Really fascinating discussion. Thank you guys for coming on.
Sure thing.